Spring 1943. For a captured soldier of Rommel's Afrika Korps, the journey was supposed to be the final humiliation. Packed into a filthy cattle car, starved, shipped to a brutal labour camp. That was the fate his own propaganda had promised. But as the train rolled through the green hills of Virginia, nothing made sense. The seat was upholstered, the ride was smooth, and now a uniformed attendant was handing him a printed menu. He stared at the choices for dinner: beef stew, frankfurters and beans, or a vegetable plate. This simple piece of paper was more disorienting than any battle in the desert. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a threat, so what was it? That menu was just the beginning. This soldier was one of nearly 400,000 Axis prisoners secretly transported across the United States in one of the war's most audacious logistical operations. Their journey, captured in private letters and diaries, reveals a profound paradox. Why would a nation locked in a total war against Nazi Germany offer its captured enemies a standard of service often denied to its own African-American soldiers? To understand this contradiction, we must go back to the desperate military calculation that brought these men to America in the first place. It began in May 1943 with the collapse of the Axis front in Tunisia. The victory was so swift, so total, that it created an immediate crisis. More than 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in a matter of days, a tide of humanity that threatened to swamp the Allies. Great Britain, already strained to its limits, sent an urgent message to Washington. It could not house, feed, or guard this many men. The problem landed squarely on the desk of US Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson. His department was now caught in a vice. On one side was international law, the 1929 Geneva Convention, which the US had ratified. Its articles were explicit. Prisoners of war must be lodged in conditions as favourable as those for the depot troops of the detaining power. Their food rations must be equivalent in quality and quantity. This was not a suggestion, it was a legal obligation. On the other side was the brutal reality of a global war. The Battle of the Atlantic was still a deadly daily fight. Every available ship was desperately needed to transport American soldiers and supplies to England for the eventual invasion of Europe. Diverting vessels to carry prisoners felt like a strategic sacrifice. Worse, it was political poison. With news of Axis atrocities filling the papers, the American public was in no mood to see their tax dollars spent on coddling the enemy. Many demanded retribution, not humane treatment. Meanwhile, the German soldiers waiting in North African collection camps had their own version of reality, one carefully constructed by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine. America, they had been taught, was a mongrel nation, a chaotic mix of races on the brink of social and economic collapse. Its army was a pathetic assembly of gangsters and misfits, its industry a hollow shell. They were being sent to a land they believed was decaying from within. Faced with a legal mandate, a logistical nightmare, and public fury, the War Department made its choice. The order was given. The first transports, hastily converted Liberty ships, were diverted to North Africa. For the Germans packed into their dark, crowded holds, the miserable voyage across the Atlantic seemed to confirm their worst fears. But what awaited them in the ports of Virginia and New York would be the first sign that everything they had been told was a lie. Stepping onto American soil at ports like Norfolk, Virginia, they were met with a procedure as cold and efficient as any military operation. They were stripped, showered, and dusted with DDT powder, a clinical, impersonal process that reinforced their status as cargo. Then they were marched under guard towards the rail yard, bracing for the final indignity, being herded into crude freight cars. But the train waiting on the siding was not for cattle. It was a line of standard Pullman passenger cars. As they filed inside, a stunned silence fell. The reality was incomprehensible. One prisoner, an artilleryman from the Afrika Korps, later wrote, "We were led to passenger cars with deeply upholstered seats. How can one reconcile this with all the things we have heard?" For the German officers, it was a crisis. They barked orders, trying to maintain discipline, but the evidence was irrefutable. The soft fabric of the seats was a more powerful counter-argument than any Allied leaflet. As the train lurched forward, pulling them deep into the vast American interior, the prisoners believed the greatest shock was now behind them. They were wrong. The journey had only just begun. The real journey began not with the turning of the wheels, but with a sound, a chime, ringing through the car, followed by a voice announcing that the dining car was now open. The men were led in small groups between the swaying carriages. They entered a space that was, for them, a memory from a forgotten world. White linen tablecloths, polished silverware, and at each table, a menu. The food that followed was a relentless assault on their senses. It wasn't just food, it was an argument. Soft white bread, a luxury not seen in Germany for years, served with a pat of real butter. Hot coffee, dark and rich, with bowls of white sugar on the table, not the coarse saccharin they were used to. One former Afrika Korps soldier, Heinz Severin, remembered his first meal vividly. Frankfurters and beans, peaches and a slice of cake. For dessert, there was often ice cream. Ice cream, a frivolous, impossible treat in a nation supposedly crippled by war. A German officer later wrote in his diary, his confusion palpable. Is this the America we have been told about? The one that is supposedly decadent and starving? Something is wrong. The food was more than sustenance. It was evidence. Every bite was a refutation of Goebbels' propaganda. Every full stomach made the Führer's promises feel hollow. When they weren't eating, they were glued to the windows. The train was a rolling cinema, projecting a film of a nation they didn't believe could exist. They passed through towns and cities untouched by a single bomb. No rubble, no skeletal ruins, just neat houses with green lawns. The roads alongside the tracks were filled not with military convoys, but with civilian automobiles, thousands of them, flowing in an endless stream. In Germany, private cars had all but vanished, their fuel and tyres requisitioned for the war. Here, they seemed as common as stones. Through the plains of the Midwest, they saw vast, horizon-spanning farms. But it was the machinery that stunned them. Gleaming red tractors and combines worked the fields with an efficiency that seemed futuristic. This wasn't a country straining to feed itself. This was a nation of overwhelming, effortless abundance. The industrial and agricultural might on display was not that of a nation on the verge of collapse, but one that hadn't even begun to flex its full power. And then came the most disorienting sight of all: the men serving them. The uniformed attendants who brought them fresh linens, the waiters who took their orders in the dining car. They were African Americans. For soldiers steeped in the Nazi ideology of a rigid racial hierarchy, this was incomprehensible. According to their worldview, these black men were Untermenschen, subhumans. Yet here they were, figures of professional authority, performing their duties with a quiet, unservile dignity. They were polite, efficient, and completely in charge of the Germans' comfort. One prisoner, a young Luftwaffe pilot, wrote home in a smuggled letter, marvelling at the well-dressed Negroes who served them as if it were the most normal thing in the world. The word he used wasn't disgust, but a kind of stunned curiosity. The world's racial order, as he had been taught it, was being turned upside down. This constant stream of contradictions began to fracture the prisoners' unity. The die-hard Nazis among them scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, they insisted, a psychological ploy to make them soft. They are showing you this to break your will, a senior NCO would lecture the younger soldiers. It is a sign of their weakness, their decadence. They treat their enemies better than their own. But for many, the seeds of doubt were already sprouting. They saw the calm confidence of the American Guards, the sheer scale of the country, the impossible wealth. They saw black men serving them with a professionalism their own ideology deemed impossible. Secret conversations rustled through the cars at night. Was it possible that everything they had fought and bled for was based on a lie? The German officers fought a desperate rearguard action, not against the Americans, but against reality itself, struggling to maintain the myth of the master race while their men were being served coffee and cake by its alleged inferiors. The prisoners saw an America of impossible plenty and strange inverted social rules. But they were seeing only what was presented to them. On these very same train lines, sometimes on the very same trains, another America existed, a reality hidden in plain sight. That hidden reality was governed by a brutal code of laws and customs known as Jim Crow. This system of racial segregation was the law of the land in the South, and its shadow fell across the entire nation. especially on its railways. The very same dining car that served as a theatre of American abundance for the Germans was a stage for humiliation for black Americans. An ironclad rule was in effect. African American soldiers, even in uniform, were often forbidden from sitting in the main dining area. They were forced to take their meals behind a curtain in the kitchen or wait until every white passenger, including the German prisoners of war they were guarding, had been served. In 1944, a black sergeant wrote to the NAACP, "They are giving the German prisoners of war better treatment than they give the American Negro soldier." This wasn't just a policy, it was a collision course. And then that collision happened. The train slowed, its brakes hissing, and came to a stop at a small, sun-baked station somewhere in the deep south. A young German corporal, full from his meal, gazed out the window. On the platform, a group of black American soldiers in uniform, just like the guards on his own train, were being herded by white military police. But they weren't being led to a train. They were being directed towards a separate, dilapidated building with a faded sign over the door, coloured waiting room. The German soldier sat frozen, looking from the clean linen on his table to the scene on the platform. He was an enemy combatant, a prisoner of war. They were American soldiers wearing the uniform of their nation. One German POW, Reinhard Buss, would later recall the moment with stunning clarity. "We were treated so much better than the black people. We were the enemy, but they were treated as the enemy." For the men watching from the train windows, this single, silent image was more powerful than any lecture. It revealed a fundamental, disturbing truth about the nation that had captured them. That truth was the final piece of the puzzle. For the soldier from the beginning, the one staring at the dinner menu, the question was never about the food. It was about the reality it represented. This journey was not an act of kindness. It was an unintentional, yet brutally effective form of de-Nazification. The evidence of America's overwhelming power, the food, the cars, the industry, demolished the Nazi myth of a decadent, collapsing nation. But the evidence of its deep racial hypocrisy simultaneously complicated the story of a war for freedom. This complex, contradictory truth was impossible to reconcile with the simple black and white ideology they had been taught. The journey didn't make them love America. For many, it simply made it impossible to continue believing. For thousands of German soldiers, the American weapon that truly shattered their worldview was not a bomb or a tank. It was a simple cup of coffee, served in a country fighting for freedom abroad while denying it to its own people at home.